Hi, I'm Greg, and in this tutorial, I'm going to be talking about flow data in PRTG and Qbilon. So, what is flow data? Flows are a protocol for collecting, aggregating, and recording the traffic flow of your network. Flow data provide a more granular view of how bandwidth and network traffic are being used and is more detailed than other monitoring solutions such as SNMP. This allows for network, user, and application monitoring. With flows, you can do things like network planning, usage-based billing and reporting, application reporting and profiling, and security analysis. For network planning, you're able to analyze trends found within the data provided by flows. This gives you the opportunity to know in advance what your network needs. With usage-based billing and reporting, that's made possible because you can identify specific traffic streams, including where they originated from, which then can be analyzed for billing clients. Application reporting and profiling is done because flow data can show not only how much traffic an application generates, but when and for whom. Lastly, with security analysis, we can see if a user generates a large amount of traffic, which isn't required for their job, or maybe their account's been compromised. Flow data can quickly review anomalies in network traffic, whether it's a worm trying to spread, malware trying to connect to a control server, or a disgruntled employee just copying sensitive company data. So let's take a look at how flow works on a diagram. So looking at this diagram, what we can see is that we have different devices that are going to be containing the flows, that are going to be actually recording the flows. So as these devices that are connected to switches, routers, things like that, communicate over the network, that network traffic is going to be recorded on these flows. So the flows are then recorded by the devices themselves, and that's going to contain information like what kind of bandwidth is being used, who's talking to whom, and what protocols and ports are being used. Once that stuff's recorded, it's basically retained on this device in a cache. And then after a certain period called the active flow timeout, that cache is flushed. Those flows are then going to be sent to a collector. In this case, obviously, we're using PRTG. And so those flows are going to be sent to one of PRTG's probes. Those probes will then consume that data. Once that data is there, it will start breaking it down. So it'll analyze the flow packets. And then based on the data within those flow packets, it's going to start feeding that information into sensors. The sensors that they're going to show, how much bandwidth was used, what protocols are used, what kind of ports were used, so on and so forth. So let's take a look at what that looks like in PRTG itself. So this is an IPFix sensor. That's a NetFlow-based sensor. This is one of the more advanced NetFlow standards. So IPFix actually has something called templating. Templates basically mean that you can describe in a template what type of information is in a flow packet. So as opposed to older protocols, or older standards, I should say, the older standards, they were quite static. So now with IPFix and NetFlow 9, those are template-based, so you can update those as necessary. So if we take a look at the sensor, what's happening here is basically those flows, again, are being sent from the device to PRTG. Once they hit PRTG, they're being broken down, and that's where we get this data that's going to be shown in our channels and also in our top lists. So first I'm going to talk about the channels. Pretty straightforward, just like any other channel within PRTG. You're going to have your last value for speed and volume. You're going to have your min, your max. It's going to be graphed just like normal. So you're going to see the different types of traffic that are flowing through this device graphed in the graph. Also, within the settings, and we'll cover this later, you can also add different filters to be able to specify, what type of data you want to see. You can also change the templating. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the next thing that's really important, that's very interesting, I should say, is the top talkers and top connections. So first we have the top talkers. This is going to be basically a report of the devices that are talking to each other the most in terms of bandwidth. So here we can see like this Microtech is talking to this applicator quite a bit. It's actually not that much, but this is a demo environment. But you can see, basically these are the top things that are talking to one another in a list. This list goes back in time, so you can go back, further in time if you want to see, if there's a specific incident, who was talking to at that point. Yeah, this could go back up to 30 days is the default. You can increase that. Again, the data for the top list is stored in a buffer, so that's going to be using active memory on the probe connection. So just keep that in mind. If you have a lot of flow sensors, or if you want to run a lot of flow sensors, make sure to kind of spread that out over different probes. Moving on to the top list, the top connections. So this is going to basically be, okay, who talked to who the most in terms of how many connections were actually built between the two devices. Then we also have top protocols, pretty straightforward. What protocols are actually in those flows the most. Again, this is a demo environment, so we have a lot of flow and the SNMP, HTTP type stuff. A typical network, it's going to be a lot more HTTP than probably anything else. And then we have senders, right? So this, again, it's being emulated. So all this stuff is coming from a specific device. Typically, you're going to see, a lot of different IPs here. But yeah, that's the basic idea between these top lists. This is the data that actually is generated by PRTG. So this isn't in the flows. Like, we're taking the data out of the flows, aggregating that data, and then figuring out what makes, the actual lists themselves. The top lists in general can be edited. So you can change kind of how those things look. You can create your own if you want. I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial, but there are also other KP articles and things like that talk about adding how to add a top list. So moving on from that, let's take a look at the settings. This is where things also get quite interesting with filters. So when we're setting up a flow sensor, the flow sensor itself is fairly simple. It's basically just going to be a sensor that sits on a probe. It's going to open up a port on that probe, and then it's your responsibility to send data to that probe. This tutorial is not going to cover how you set up devices to send flows. Those are going to be very manufacturer specific. So with like Cisco devices, it's going to be like 4 or 5 lines of configuration that you have to put in there. At the end of the day, what you're going to have to define is a few things, and it kind of mirrors what we're seeing here as well. Obviously, where you're sending it to. So where's your NetFlow collector? That's going to be your probe's IP or DNS name. Which port it's going to be listening on. This is something that you can define yourself. There are standard ports for NetFlow. If you want to use them, you don't have to. It all depends on what you're willing to open up on that probe. Right. So on the device side, it's going to be the collector IP. It's going to be the collector's port. Then you're also usually going to have to define your active flow timeout and your sampling mode. So active flow timeout, like I mentioned before, is going to be where the device is going to be collecting all of these flow packets, and then at a certain point, it's going to flush them out. It doesn't make sense for the device to be streaming them constantly, and so that's why you have this thing called the active flow timeout. If you set the active flow timeout to 0, like it is here, what PRTG is going to do is it's going to timestamp all of those flows with the moment that it received them. So this is generally only used if there's kind of a problem with the flow implementation on your device or for troubleshooting, because essentially what happens is if you have an active flow timeout of 5 minutes and you have a device that sends a bunch of flows, but also, for the last 5 minutes, but also a few from like 6 minutes ago and 7 minutes ago, PRTG kind of discards those 6 and 7 minutes ago, just because it can be very confusing. It convolutes the timestamps and like the actual graphs of when flows and data are coming in. And so typically what you really want to do is you want to set like an active flow timeout of say like 2 or 3 minutes on the device, and then like 4 or 5 minutes on PRTG. You want to have the PRTG active flow timeout a little bit higher than on the device, just in case there is a bit of lag there. But you don't want those to be like wildly different from one another. Otherwise, you're going to see discrepancies in the actual data and the graphs of data. So if like you have an SNMP traffic sensor and you have a NetFlow sensor on the same exact port or something like that, you're going to see discrepancies if you don't set the active flow timeout correctly. Going to sampling mode, depending on how much traffic is flowing over that device, it could be a lot of flows. So typically speaking, so you're not overrunning the buffer on the device or on PRTG. You can enable sampling. So it's going to be taking a portion of that data instead of every single port, every single packet that's flowing over that device. You can set up sampling mode and set that up. Here we can see that we have, this is a custom IP fix sensor. So here we're actually defining specifically what channels we want. This is something that is a bit more advanced, but if you want to see stuff that's outside of the normal channel definition, and I can show that real quick as well, then you can define a custom sensor like this. If we take a look at a normal IP fix sensor, what we're going to see there is the standard channels that we have set up. So that's going to be web, file transfer, etc. As you can see in the other sensor, we have a lot more channels defined. Open that up a little bit. And depending on your use case, that's it's entirely up to you how you want to define those. Depending on what protocols and things like that are supported by your flow and by your device, this is going to be possible or not. Some very good use case for this bit right here, the stream, the data handling of the stream data, is that you can store the stream data for like your other channel. So for example, if you're seeing, okay, in my 5 channels, I have 30% of the traffic, but the other 70% is classified as other. What you can do is you can log that data to a stream and then take a look at that, see what the other data is, and then going back to kind of the channel definition, you can go in and define what that other type of data is, and then get a better handle and be able to break down those packets better, so you get better visibility into what protocols are being sent and what the devices are talking to each other with over your network. So the last thing I'll talk about here with PRTG is filtering. So with filtering, what you can do is you can set up multiple sensors for a single device, and you can then restrict them or include or exclude specific things within the sensor. So basically the data is going to come in from the device. The probe's then going to break it down, but it's going to break it down according to these filters. So if you, for example, only want to see the flow data that's coming from going over a switch that's directly connected to a web server, for example, and you just want to see what's happening on that web server as opposed to everything else that's happening on the switch, you could say, okay, I just want to see the net flow that's going to the specific destination IP address or a specific protocol, and so on and so forth. I mean, you can read here the different things that are filterable. These are specific for IPFix. But yeah, it's the idea behind this is that you could set up, instead of just having kind of a generic, okay, this is, all the traffic going over this specific switch. You could also say, this is all the traffic that's going over this specific port on this switch or going over this switch to a specific IP address. So if you were trying to get more analysis, if you're trying to get into try to troubleshoot something more specifically with NetFlow, the idea is that you could, add another sensor to a device, just like the NetFlow sensor that we see here, and then start specifying specific filters within that, and then you're going to see different results that are going to be specific to that filter. So that's it for my bit for our PRTG on Flow. A lot of this stuff is covered in our KB and in other places. If you have any questions, feel free to hit up our support about these sensors. They're quite awesome sensors. They're extremely useful, especially when it comes to troubleshooting. And the next thing we're going to take a look at is how that comes across in Qbilon. If you're not familiar with Qbilon, what it does is it takes different data from different sources, and it's going to combine that data together into different elements. And then within Qbilon itself, it's going to build what they call a meta model. The meta model is going to build the relationship between the different elements and the different properties that they have, and then you're able to run analysis and things like that on it. It's hard to explain. You really have to use it for yourself. I'm going to cover a little bit about it, just kind of the basics for what we're talking about with Flow. But it's a great tool. It's extremely powerful. It's so powerful that I can't even describe it in a few sentences. So definitely check it out. Contact us for a trial, and we can definitely get that going for you. So just to cover how this works with PRTG first, the first thing you're going to have to do to be able to start building up all these fancy diagrams is add data. So here we already have our PRTG data source. You can schedule your data sources to run on a specific schedule. It's going to tell you, when it last ran, how long it took to run, when it's going to run next, and so on and so forth. You can then edit those things after the fact. For PRTG itself, if we take a look at the data sources, it's pretty straightforward. You're just going to give it the URL, the username, pass hash. You can decide whether or not to load the sensors. So if you want the actual sensors in Qbilon itself, you can. Otherwise, it's just going to do devices and groups and probes. Obviously, you can allow it for HTTP or HTTPS if necessary. And by default, we're going to create standard views. So one of the standard views we're going to be looking at today is going to be this flow view. So this is what a flow view looks like. What's happening here is that Qbilon is contacting PRTG. It's getting all the flow data that's already been analyzed by PRTG. So it's basically taking the results from the monitoring data, and it's going to be building up those relationships. And so what's happening here is we're seeing which devices in PRTG are actually talking to one another, but in a visual format. Beyond just being able to visualize it like this, What you can also do is, if we take a look at specifically the relationships, you then can also be able to see, okay, this microtik and this applicator, again, using that same example, they're talking to one another, but we want to know what. So we're going to see here the source port list, so the different ports that are going to be used as the source, and then also what the target ports are. Depending on what those are going to be, that's going to define which protocols are going to actually be there. And then when we take a look at the devices, this is a little bit different. This is the different data. This is not coming from the flows. This is actually coming from PRTG itself. And this is kind of to give you an idea of what Qbilon does. Like as you add different data sources, so you have here 3 different data sources. From these different data sources, all this data is going to be combined to give this element different properties. Based on those different properties, we're going to be able to do stuff within these views. So beyond being able to build relationships between things, and this goes way above and beyond just being able to build relationships in terms of like flows. I'm going to show that in a second. You can also build relationships between a probe and what it's actually monitoring. You can build relationships between different servers. You can build relationships between, in the cloud, an AWS region, and things that are in the region, or a database that's connected to it. There's all sorts of different ways that you can build relationships between things in Qbilon, and that's really the idea behind Qbilon, is giving you an idea of what's connected to what, how it's talking to it. Even at like an organizational or company level, if you want to say, hey, this department has this application has these devices in it, and these devices have specific monitoring data, or these devices are running in the cloud and they're doing X, Y, and Z. All that data you can put into Qbilon, manipulate it, and then build these kinds of graphs. And that all comes down to these properties. So basically, each element is going to be comprised of a lot of different properties, and depending on the sources that you have, between VMware and all those other different sources that you saw earlier, all those different sources are going to provide different data, and based on that different data, you're going to be able to do different analysis. For our purposes here, pretty straightforward. We're just talking about PRTG and flow. So we have the flow data here. The flow data is in the relationships as well as with the devices. And then you have the device itself. In this case, this applicator, we have the contact info, the host name, IP address, and this is where it gets really interesting, is with the number of sensors. And so based on like the number of sensors and things like that, we can start running analysis. But you're going to see here, we also have the object ID and whatnot. And then also what's really helpful is the PRTG URL. So for example, if we run an analysis on this graph right here, and we say, okay, I want to see everything that has more sensors than 0 that are in a warning state. And we want to color that yellow. You immediately see, okay, which devices are in a warning state. So this is a great way to take a look at your entire network through flows, and then associate that with specific sensor data and see, okay, this watchdog firewall for some reason is in a warning state. What's connected to it and what could be affected by that outage? Or even better, if we say, okay, I want to see everything that has more sensors than 0 that are down, and you click on that. And so we say, whoa, okay, this msp.prtg.dev.lan, there's something wrong there. What's connected to it? What else could be affected? Oh, well, this is a warning. This is a warning. You can immediately identify what kind of waterfall effect or butterfly effect that outage is happening in real time with these kinds of graphs. And again, this is just based on a couple of those properties that were there. There are a lot of other properties. The more data sources that you add, the better, the more rich data that you're going to have within Qbilon, and you can take that to build richer graphs and views to be able to see, what's going on in your network at a very high level. So with all that in mind, some of the other views that you can build with the data from PRTG and other sources look a little bit like this. This is going to be like an AWS overview. So here you're going to be able to see the relationships between like different VPCs or regions, their data source, EC2 instances. All this data is actually coming directly from AWS. So again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, there are a lot of different data sources that you can add into Qbilon. As you add more stuff, vSphere data, AWS data, so on and so forth, you're going to be able to get a lot more out of Qbilon. From PRTG itself, you're going to be able to get a device inventory. So you're also able to do table type analysis as well, or views as well. And last but not least, there's also things like graphs and charts. So here we just see, like, based on the information out of the PRTG system information, what operating system is running, how often on so many servers across the organization. So that's the end of this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful. If so, feel free to give it a like or consider subscribing. You can find additional information below the video, like the links I mentioned earlier. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact our awesome support team through our support portal, also linked below. Keep an eye out for our next video, and have a great day.